On the surface, Miller's Grove was the sort of town that rarely made the news. Nestled between wide fields and winding back roads, it was the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other, schools held seasonal fairs, and the loudest disturbance was often just a barking dog. Life there was calm and predictable, which is why when the call came in on a damp October evening, the officers on duty hardly expected anything out of the ordinary. The dispatcher relayed the report from a passerby who had been walking near the outskirts of town. The man claimed there was a stench coming from the old farmhouse at the end of Birch Hollow Road, a place long thought to be abandoned. It was not unusual for animals to crawl into places like that and die, leaving behind a foul smell, and so the officers drove out with the thought that they might be dealing with something unpleasant but simple. The rain had just started to fall when their patrol cars pulled up the dirt driveway. Headlights illuminated the sagging wooden structure, its roof caved in at one end, and windows shattered from years of neglect. Grass and weeds had grown tall around the porch, giving the impression that no human had stepped foot inside in years. Yet, as they approached, the odor grew thicker, heavier, and sickening, the kind of smell that clings to clothes and seeps into the back of your throat. Even before opening the door, some of the officers felt their nerves tighten. Though they pushed the feeling aside, they had been trained for worse, or so they thought. The front door opened with a groan, the hinges struggling under years of rust. Flashlights cut across the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and an eerie silence. The house looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just decay, it was the sense that someone had been there recently. In the living room, the first strange detail appeared. Small children's shoes lying in a row along the wall, covered in dust but oddly arranged with care. Nearby, a broken rocking horse sat at an angle, its painted eyes seeming to watch whoever entered. Officers moved carefully through the space, their boots crunching over shattered glass and debris. As they advanced, they found evidence that contradicted the idea of an empty building. The kitchen counter held burned-down candles with wax pooled across the surface. A single plate, cracked down the middle, sat with the remains of what looked like a meal long rotted. A chair had been pulled close to the counter as if someone had recently sat to eat by candlelight. The unease grew heavier. It wasn't just a derelict property anymore. Someone had used this place, and the smell suggested something much darker than spoiled food or mold. The hallway told another story. Torn children's clothing lay scattered on the floor, some items so small they could only belong to toddlers. A faded teddy bear leaned against the wall with stuffing torn from its seams. Every step deeper into the house pulled the officers further away from the idea that this was a routine welfare check. The upstairs rooms showed signs of squatters, with dirty blankets piled in corners. But it was what wasn't there that made the silence louder. No footprints on the dusty floors, no personal belongings like wallets or phones, nothing that would point to an ordinary person taking refuge. Instead, everything suggested deliberate choices, as if whoever had used the house wanted to erase their presence, but leave behind symbols that unsettled anyone who came looking. When one officer opened a closet, he nearly recoiled. Inside hung dresses for small children, old-fashioned in style. Their colors faded, but still recognizable as clothing meant for someone young. They were hung neatly, as if displayed, each one swaying slightly in the draft from the opened door. It was this discovery that shifted the investigation from unease to dread. What reason could there be for clothing like that to be kept in such a place? And why was the smell of rot so strong if no bodies were visible upstairs? The deeper they searched, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Some officers described later that it felt as if the house itself was watching them. Every creak of the floorboards echoing louder than it should, every gust of wind rattling the walls like a whisper. They noted the marks on the floorboards, scratches that seemed too deep and too deliberate, as though furniture had been dragged repeatedly to block or hide something. One officer shined his flashlight over the wall and paused. Scraped into the plaster were small markings, crude shapes that looked like stick figures. At first it could have been dismissed as graffiti, but the quantity and repetition gave the impression of obsession, like someone had carved them over and over with a trembling hand. By the time the officers gathered again in the main hallway, The mood had shifted entirely. They were no longer investigating an old building. They were stepping into something far more sinister. The dispatcher's call had prepared them for an odor. Maybe a dead animal or a squatter's trash. But nothing could have readied them for the strange artifacts of suffering they were beginning to piece together. The smell was strongest near the back of the house, where a wooden door sat partially ajar leading downward. The basement. The flashlights pointed toward the opening, their beams swallowed by the blackness below. It was clear that whatever they had stumbled upon wasn't going to be solved by a simple report. The nightmare was only just beginning, and every officer on the scene would later admit that the moment they stepped into that farmhouse, something inside them already knew they would never walk away the same. The door to the basement groaned as it opened wider, and a rush of air carrying the unbearable stench poured into the hallway. The officers hesitated, each man and woman silently wrestling with the instinct to turn back. Still, duty pushed them forward, flashlights aimed into the darkness. The wooden steps creaked with every cautious footfall, threatening to collapse under the weight of their boots. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, a damp chill wrapping itself around their throats like invisible fingers. By the time they reached the bottom, it was not just the smell that made them sick, but the sight of what the light revealed. Scattered across the floor were fragments of toys, broken beyond repair. A headless doll lay in the dirt, its porcelain face shattered into jagged pieces. A toy truck rested on its side with one wheel missing. There were puzzle pieces, worn and dirty, spread out as though they had been dumped there deliberately. It wasn't the kind of clutter left by children at play. It was a collection that seemed staged, placed for reasons too dark to guess. A small blanket, torn and stiff with age, was folded neatly in a corner as if it had once served as comfort for someone who never truly escaped. The walls of the basement were covered in crude carvings. Symbols that none of them immediately recognized filled the wooden panels, etched deep into the surface, as if by someone who had spent countless hours scratching them in. Stick figures were drawn again and again, sometimes standing, sometimes bound, and sometimes surrounded by jagged lines that looked like cages. The more they looked, the more disturbing the imagery became. Some figures appeared to be children, sketched with oversized heads and thin bodies, while others were taller, looming over them in grotesque postures. Dried streaks of what looked like old blood marked parts of the walls, blending with the carvings in a way that made it difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. It was then that one officer's light caught something hidden behind a pile of wooden crates, stacked unevenly against the far wall. The boxes looked deliberately placed, and the smell was stronger there, pressing them to investigate further. When the crates were pushed aside, the truth of the farmhouse began to unfold in full horror. Behind them was a small makeshift room enclosed with thin wooden boards. Inside stood a narrow bed, its mattress stained and bound to the wall by heavy iron chains. The chains were bolted into the concrete, leaving no chance of movement beyond the length of a few feet. At the foot of the bed lay a rusted metal bowl, its edges corroded and sharp. The officers stared in silence, their stomachs twisting with the reality that this was no accident. Someone had built this room for captivity. But the horror did not stop with the diary. Further pages revealed strange shifts in handwriting. Some were neat and controlled, others chaotic and almost illegible, as if written by a trembling hand or by someone else entirely. The officers began to realize this was not the work of a single individual. Multiple voices seemed to speak from those pages, each taking ownership of different victims, each describing unspeakable acts with chilling pride or detached cruelty. The implication was unbearable. This farmhouse had not belonged to one predator, but to a group. Even as their minds reeled, they noticed more details around the hidden room. A child's drawing was pinned to one wall. The paper yellowed with time. It showed a crude house with stick figures standing outside it, smiling faces drawn with crayon. But at the edge of the page, faint and almost hidden, was a figure drawn in black with no face at all. On the dirt floor nearby, dozens of candle stubs had melted into uneven pools of wax, arranged in circles. Some had faint traces of hair or fabric caught in the hardened wax, suggesting rituals of some kind, or at the very least, acts meant to leave symbolic reminders of torment. On a small wooden table inside the enclosure sat a diary. Its cover was cracked leather, pages swollen from years of dampness. One of the officers carefully flipped it open with gloved hands, and the entries inside stopped everyone cold. The handwriting was uneven and frantic, words scrawled in a way that seemed desperate. The diary described in haunting detail the daily life of children held in the room. The entries spoke of cries echoing through the night, of punishments meted out for disobedience, and of the crushing loneliness of days spent chained to the wall. The names written there were familiar, names of children who had gone missing in Miller's Grove and surrounding towns, names that had been etched on missing posters, whispered in news reports, and eventually forgotten when the cases went cold. Each word brought back the ghost of a child who had once been loved, and now their fate was recorded in a book left to rot in the shadows. By the time they emerged back into the damp night air, the weight of what they had discovered clung to them like the smell in their clothes. The farmhouse had shifted from a derelict building to something unspeakable, a monument to years of hidden suffering. The diary, the chains, the carvings, and the drawings were all pieces of a puzzle no one had wanted to solve. The investigation was only beginning, but one fact had already become clear to every officer on the scene. The evil inside that basement was far greater than anything they had imagined when they first received the call, and worse still, the signs suggested it had gone on for far longer than anyone dared to admit. The officers' flashlights trembled as they tried to take in every detail. Each object, each mark on the wall, each entry in the diary painted a picture darker than they had ever encountered in their careers. This was no ordinary crime scene. It was a house designed for cruelty, where children had suffered in silence while the world outside carried on in ignorance. The diary was carried out of the basement with the same caution one might use for an explosive. Investigators gathered around, their gloves smudging the cracked cover as they placed it on a table at the station for closer study. Each page was a descent deeper into madness. The early entries were almost childlike. Simple observations about keeping someone quiet or describing days when the captive would cry until exhaustion silenced them. As the pages went on, the tone shifted. The words became more clinical, as though the writer were documenting in experiments rather than lives. The shift in handwriting only deepened the horror. Some entries were neat and methodical, listing times and dates with precision, while others were frenzied, scribbled with jagged lines and blotches of ink where the pen had pressed too hard. It became undeniable that the book held the voices of multiple people, each confessing to acts that had destroyed families and left questions unanswered for decades. Detectives cross-referenced the names mentioned with old case files. The connections lined up with chilling accuracy. A girl who vanished on her way home from school 15 years earlier. A boy last seen riding his bicycle down a quiet street. Siblings reported missing during a summer camping trip. One by one, the long-forgotten tragedies resurfaced, their echoes now louder than ever. The realization settled heavily. This diary was not a work of fiction or fantasy. It was a ledger of torment. Every line was a record of suffering carried out in the walls of that farmhouse. The implications spiraled quickly. If more than one person was involved, then the crimes could not have been isolated incidents by a single recluse hiding in the woods. This was organized, maintained, and carefully concealed. That explained why the house looked abandoned yet lived in. That explained why some of the graves unearthed outside seemed older, while others were far more recent. Different people had taken over the same cruel ritual, generation after generation, passing down their secret, as though it were some twisted inheritance. Officers pored over the handwriting samples, and analysts began comparing them with documents from people once connected to the property. The farmhouse had belonged to the Doran family decades ago, a reclusive group that kept to themselves and rarely ventured into town. Rumors about them had circulated in hushed whispers, strange lights in the windows, odd noises late at night, but nothing had ever been proven. Most residents dismissed it as gossip, Now, it seemed the rumors had been grounded in something far darker. The diary contained more than names. There were crude maps sketched in margins, showing trees, clearings, and hollow markers that resembled burial sites. Investigators fanned out to these locations, and what they unearthed shook them further. Beneath layers of soil, they found bones wrapped in weathered sheets. Some skeletons were small, unmistakably belonging to children. Forensic teams handled each with quiet reverence, but even the professionals admitted later that this case tested their limits. It was not just the bodies, it was the realization that for every grave uncovered, there could be more still hidden, each one carrying another story of innocence stolen. Among the more disturbing elements were the changing perspectives in the diary. Some entries expressed enjoyment, reveling in cruelty as though it were entertainment. Others wrote with a sense of duty, speaking of continuing the work, or keeping the tradition alive. These phrases suggested not just multiple perpetrators, but a belief system that tied them together. It was less about one disturbed individual and more about a legacy of horror, maintained deliberately over decades. The fact that the diary had been left in the basement instead of destroyed hinted that whoever last used the farmhouse believed they would never be caught, or worse, that they wanted someone to eventually discover it and bear the weight of their deeds. The media caught wind of the discoveries, but the authorities tried to contain the details. They feared the panic that would erupt if the town learned how deep this went. Families who had long given up hope of answers suddenly had old wounds torn open. The names in the diary matched children whose photographs still hung on fading posters in police storage rooms. Investigators who had once retired with the guilt of unsolved cases were now confronted with the truth they never expected to find. It was supposed to bring closure, but instead it unleashed a storm of grief and anger. The officers who first stepped into the house struggled with sleepless nights. They replayed the images in their minds, the chains bolted to the wall, the children's clothing, the carvings on the wood. Many admitted later that even in silence they could still hear the cries described in the diary, their imaginations filling the gaps left by the chilling words. What made it worse was the uncertainty. If the perpetrators were still alive, then perhaps the house was not the only place where these horrors had occurred. Perhaps there were other rooms, other houses, other graves waiting to be found. As investigators connected the dots, they realized that some entries hinted at more recent activity. Dates scrawled within the last few years matched disappearances, still unsolved. One entry in particular described a child with details so precise that investigators immediately linked it to a boy who had vanished only 2 summers ago. That meant the crimes had not stopped long ago. They had continued until nearly the present day. Someone alive, someone nearby, had been responsible for ensuring that the house remained active. The possibility that the killer, or killers, were still living in the community was more terrifying than anything found in the basement. The farmhouse was sealed off as a crime scene, but its presence loomed over the town like a shadow. Investigators knew they had unearthed the beginning of something much larger, and that the deeper they dug into the history of the Doran family, the more unspeakable truths they would uncover. The diary was no longer just evidence. It was a confession spread across decades, pointing to a legacy of evil that refused to die with time. Every body told its own silent story. Some were reduced to skeletons, victims claimed decades ago, while others still had remnants of clothing clinging to their frames. In some cases, personal items remained: a small bracelet, a shoe, a rusted locket. These items, though simple, carried the weight of entire lives, and officers treated them with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. Each time something was pulled from the earth, the reality pressed harder on everyone involved. These were children whose absence had haunted families for years, children who had been swallowed by the woods while their parents clung to hope. Now their resting places were exposed, and the answers they brought were more devastating than the unknown. The search teams moved beyond the farmhouse, driven by the maps and sketches found in the diary. The crude drawings had marked certain trees and open spaces, and though they looked amateurish, they lined up eerily well with the landscape surrounding the property. Officers, forensic experts, and cadaver dogs spread out across the dense woods, their boots sinking into the wet soil, as rain continued to drizzle over the area. It didn't take long for the first grim discovery. Near the roots of a gnarled oak tree, the dogs began to dig and bark furiously. The soil was loose, fresher than expected for ground that should have been undisturbed. When investigators carefully removed the earth, the corner of a sheet appeared, brittle and stained. Beneath it were bones small enough to confirm what they had feared. The discovery set off a chain of excavation points across the woods. Shallow graves, some so shallow that bones nearly protruded from the ground, were uncovered in several places. Each revealed remains wrapped hastily, as though the person burying them had been in a rush, or had grown careless after years of repetition. Forensic teams worked in silence, their gloves brushing away dirt as cameras captured every detail. The silence was broken only by the sound of officers retching when the reality of what they were uncovering became too much to bear. Even those hardened by years of crime scenes admitted this was unlike anything they had faced before. The further the search extended, the more chilling the scale became. It wasn't one or two graves, it was dozens. The woods themselves had become a cemetery, hiding secrets in plain sight. Some officers whispered later that the placement of the graves felt almost ritualistic, arranged in clusters as though following a deliberate pattern. The candle stubs found in the basement suggested ceremonies or gatherings, and the arrangement of the graves seemed to echo that possibility. Whether the burials were symbolic or simply practical, no one could deny the sheer number of victims pointed to a level of horror that was methodical rather than chaotic. As the remains were collected and catalogued, grief spread beyond the crime scene. Families who had lived for decades with unanswered questions were suddenly thrust back into raw pain. For some, the remains matched missing persons they had mourned long ago, while for others, the discoveries confirmed the darkest fears they had tried to bury. Vigils began to appear in town almost immediately, with candles lit in windows and photographs of lost children displayed on church steps. The farmhouse was no longer just a crime scene, it had become the epicenter of a tragedy that belonged to everyone in Miller's Grove. The officers who uncovered the graves carried an invisible burden. They returned to the station unable to eat, their hands shaking long after they removed their gloves. Many confessed to nightmares filled with images of small skeletons wrapped in cloth, images that refused to leave even in daylight. Forensic pathologists, used to dealing with death in clinical detachment, admitted they cried privately after analyzing the remains. The scale of the cruelty was too immense to be processed like any ordinary case. Some said it felt as though the woods themselves held a curse, that walking among those graves meant absorbing the despair of the lives cut short. By the time the search teams wrapped for the day, the woods looked scarred, dotted with flagged markers, and open pits where graves had been exhumed. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, its windows like hollow eyes staring out at the scene, bearing witness to every horror that had unfolded in its shadow. Officers left with the knowledge that the case had grown far larger than anyone anticipated. What had begun as a report of a strange smell in an old building had unraveled into one of the darkest darkers in the region's history. And though they packed up their tools and evidence, no one left the grounds unchanged. For those who had seen what lay beneath the soil, the image would remain etched into their memories forever, a constant reminder of how evil could hide in plain sight for decades. The most haunting realization came with the discovery of graves that were recent. The soil was disturbed within the last few years, and the remains inside were far from ancient. That meant the crimes had not stopped in the distant past, but had continued nearly until the moment authorities arrived. Whoever had carried on the twisted legacy of the farmhouse was still alive when the officers first stepped inside. The thought chilled the investigation team, because it suggested that the perpetrator or perpetrators could still be out there, walking freely among neighbors, blending into the quiet rhythms of town life. Each new discovery brought the case into sharper focus. It was no longer speculation that multiple people were involved. The sheer time span of the graves confirmed it. Generations had taken part, passing down the knowledge of suffering like some grotesque family heirloom. The horror was sustained by secrecy, hidden under the very soil townsfolk walked upon every day. What struck investigators most was how such a nightmare had gone undetected for so long. right beneath the noses of a community that believed itself safe. As investigators dug into genealogy and traced distant relatives, a chilling realization formed. Two of the main suspects had already died years ago, never facing justice for the lives they had destroyed. But one remained, living only a few miles away in a modest home. An elderly man with thinning hair and a weathered face had been hiding in plain sight. He was known in passing by neighbors as polite, even kind, always seen tending his garden or feeding stray cats. To those who waved at him on the street, he was nothing more than a harmless old man nearing the end of his days. No one suspected he had once walked into the basement of the farmhouse carrying chains and diaries that recorded unspeakable acts. The shock that rippled through Miller's Grove was indescribable when his connection to the farmhouse was revealed. For years he had lived quietly, attending church services and shopping at local markets, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had lost children to his family's secret. Parents who had cried themselves to sleep, wondering what had happened to their sons and daughters, now realized they had passed their tormentor in grocery aisles, offered him casual greetings, even shared conversations without a clue of the darkness behind his eyes. The betrayal was almost too much to comprehend. When the dust began to settle around the farmhouse and the woods, investigators faced the most daunting task of all: piecing together the identities of the people behind the horrors. The evidence pointed back to the Doran family, whose presence in the community had been little more than a shadow for generations. Old property records revealed that the farmhouse had passed down through their bloodline, each successor withdrawing further from public life, until eventually the family was spoken of as little more than a rumor. They rarely came into town, rarely interacted with neighbors, and yet their land was never abandoned. Each generation had carried on the same existence, tucked away from prying eyes, and now it became clear that existence was soaked in blood. What unsettled people most during the trial was the lack of remorse. Though age had dulled his body, the man's face remained unreadable as evidence was presented. When passages from the diary were read aloud, he stared forward with an expression that revealed neither guilt nor sorrow. Psychologists later suggested that the crimes had become normalized in his mind, ingrained through years of participation, and perhaps indoctrination by family members who taught him cruelty as if it were duty. To him the horrors were not atrocities but traditions to be maintained, a way of life so twisted it was impossible for outsiders to grasp. The trial that followed drew national attention. Courtrooms were packed with journalists, and images of the old man, handcuffed and frail, spread across television screens. Prosecutors laid out the evidence: the diary filled with multiple handwritings, the chains bolted to the walls, the graves spread across the woods. Forensic experts testified about the remains, each explanation more harrowing than the last. Families of the victims filled the benches, clutching photographs of children who had never come home. Their sobs punctuated the cold recitation of evidence, reminding everyone in the room that these were not just case numbers or bones, they were lives cut short. Even after the guilty verdict, closure remained elusive. Families had answers but no true justice. The perpetrators who had started the chain of evil were gone, buried without ever facing accountability. The last living member of the bloodline would spend his remaining years in prison. But that felt hollow compared to the decades of suffering he had helped cause. Parents who had once prayed for miracles now wrestled with the reality that their children had spent their final days in a basement chained to a wall, their lives recorded in a diary like trophies. Closure was not possible, only survival in the face of truth. In Miller's Grove, life struggled to return to normal, but the shadow of the farmhouse loomed over every resident. Parents clutched their children tighter, locking doors and watching strangers with suspicion. The farmhouse itself was eventually demolished. But even as the wood splintered and the walls collapsed, people whispered that its foundations still seemed to breathe despair. Some argued it should have been burned, reduced to ash so nothing of it remained. Others insisted it should stand as a monument, a warning to never ignore the strange and unexplainable again. In the end, the land was left empty, a scar on the town that no new house could ever heal. The story reached far beyond Miller's Grove, carried by reporters who called it one of the most heartbreaking crimes in modern history. It was not just the scale of the tragedy, but the cruel simplicity of how it was hidden. Evil had thrived in plain sight, cloaked by normalcy, buried under the routines of everyday life. The farmhouse had been more than a building, it had been a mask for generations of torment, and when that mask was pulled away, the raw horror was almost too much for anyone to face. For the officers, the ordeal left permanent scars. Several sought therapy, admitting that no amount of professional training could have prepared them for what they uncovered. Some were haunted by the drawings carved into the basement walls, others by the graves they unearthed in the woods. One officer resigned within weeks, unable to continue in a profession that constantly reminded him of the farmhouse. Another confided that the smell from that night never truly left, lingering in his memory even in the cleanest of places. Their experiences became a quiet testimony to the fact that sometimes the cost of discovery is too high to bear. Though years would pass, the officers who first entered the house carried the weight with them forever. They had been trained to handle crime, to withstand violence and chaos, but nothing could have prepared them for the despair that clung to the walls of that farmhouse. What they saw there was not just a crime scene, it was the collapse of innocence, a revelation that evil can hide in the quietest places, waiting for the moment when someone is brave enough to lift the floorboards and see what has been festering underneath. And for many of them that bravery came at the cost of their peace, stolen in a single night that would haunt them for the rest of their lives.